Die Diaspora spricht.
Parlando.
Diasporas rede.
Falando. Diasporas
Diaspora spricht.
Diasporas Speaking.
Përshëndetje. My name is Rina Limoni and I am the host of Diasporas Speaking. In this episode, we are joined by Nik Jovčić-Sas, who explores the often overlooked history of LGBT plus individuals within Orthodox Christianity. For this discussion, I have invited Arbër-Qerka Gashi to co-host the session due to his expertise in gender and LGBT plus issues, as well as Serbian history. Welcome to Diasporas Speaking, Nik. It's a pleasure having you here today and holding this discussion together with Arbër Gashi.
Zdravo, good to see you.
As you might have heard, we start the conversation with 3 questions. Where are you from? Where did you grow up? And what do you do in your day-to-day?
Yeah, so my family's originally from Serbia, but I was brought up in rural Somerset in the UK. And I guess I have a slightly unusual diaspora story, or one that I feel is like not so often told. My mum's family were exiled from Yugoslavia by Tito. And yeah, my mum, their family moved to Paris, and then they moved to Rabat in Morocco, where my mum grew up. And she ended up meeting my dad, and then they moved to Somerset, where I grew up. And at the time, my family was the only immigrant family in the very, very small village I grew up in. And that caused me a lot of problems growing up.
Thank you so much for being here. This sounds really interesting to hear about your own kind of like diaspora experience, kind of like being that intergenerational experience of persistent migration is something that often really isn't spoken about within the Balkan space as well. And just kind of like touching on your experience as an ethnic minority in the Somerset context, I'd like to hear more about this experience from potentially being racialized as a young child, or just feeling like that real lack of representation for somebody who comes from the Balkan region that really has no sense of representation in most mainstream British discourses.
Yeah, it was a very sort of odd context in some ways. I grew up in a village called Clandown, which is, very homogeneously white English. And I think sometimes people might not perceive it that way, but even though, I'm white, people perceived us very much as other, and we were absolutely hated for that. Most people's families had lived in that village and in the towns in that area for generations. So, my family were really outsiders, and the hatred we experienced was quite extreme. I was bullied a lot in school. People would often tell me to go back to my own country. People would shout insults out of the car window at me and my mum as we'd walk home from school. The most extreme incident was when I was about 17, 16. Our house was targeted as with a firebombing. And that was just, such an extreme experience of violence. And I guess also was disorienting as well, because there were no other Balkan people around me in the village I grew up in. Like, we would go to Serbia for long summer holidays, I think, which is quite key immigrant experience. But outside of that, I didn't have other Serbs or even any other Balkan people, or even any other immigrants to really share my experience with. Yeah, it was just a very alienating experience.
I think what's really interesting is kind of hearing your perspective from a non-London kind of point of view, because oftentimes, as somebody that was born and raised in London from the refugee background myself, although obviously we go through our own struggles of being raised within this space, but having access to different migrant communities and refugee communities does really provide us a sense of solace. So I think it's so important for individuals that are born or grew up in rural parts of the UK to actually have their voice and express themselves regarding their own experiences, because it must have been very difficult being super racialized within the context of Somerset and not having that sense of any sense of Balkan representation at all.
when we first spoke about this episode, you mentioned this experience, how alienating, as you're saying, it is. But then you said something that really stuck with me, and I thought it's very important that we mention this as Balkan people. You said Enat was a driver of my identity.
Absolutely. I mean, so for those of you who don't know, Enat is a word that doesn't have like a direct translation into English, and it's often seen as like the typical Serbian characteristic. And the most literal translation is spite, but it means, I think we'd conceptualize it more as like rebellious defiance. And for me, this idea and this concept gave me so much strength in the face of the discrimination I faced when I was growing up. When we were talking, I was thinking about one particular story that really stuck with me my whole life. Was one day I came home from school after being like really badly bullied, and I was crying, and my parents demanded to have a meeting with my teacher. We had the meeting with the teacher, and my parents had their concerns, and the teacher said to my parents, "Don't worry, Nicholas can be as English as anybody else." And I think there was a certain pressure and a certain expectation from the environment I grew up in, is that because, you know, I'm white, that I have to assimilate. And that if I don't assimilate and I don't then take the privilege of that assimilation, that there's something wrong with me, that there's something weird, that I'm being difficult, that I'm, you know, there's something unnecessary or ridiculous about my ethnic identity. And I think preserving and keeping my cultural traditions, my cultural identity in the face of that was just so important. And I think that was really amplified by the fact that my mum and my grandmother were refugees. I think when you're forced to leave your home country, there's something I think that like makes that identity so much more, even more special and even more sacred. And I think the fact that also my family left at a particular time, and I think in the certain kind of cultural context in which they left. It's funny, my grandmother, I think she went back to Serbia twice, like after she left, and she like lived in Morocco for like over 50 years. And, you know, I'd ask her, why don't you want to go back? And she was like, because the country I'm from is dead. And she did not see continuity between Serbia today and the country she grew up in.
And kind of like moving on to like your own Serbian identity and your relationship with the Orthodox faith. I think coming from my perspective, I studied kind of gender sexuality in my master's, and my focus was really looking at like the reconciliation between Muslim and LGBT plus identities in one. So I guess I just wanted to kind of put the question to you as somebody who identifies as queer and also Serbian Orthodox. How are you able to kind of, I guess not how, but like how do you see yourself in terms of all the kind of intersections that make you who you are, especially against a backdrop that perpetuates the notion that religion and sexuality are always at odds with one another?
Yeah, that's a big question. It's also what's so central to my personal identity and also to my work. So, you know, as I was saying to you guys, I grew up in this very kind of intolerant background, and my family's identity gave me so much strength and like a source of like resilience, that Enat. And then when I was about 11 years old was the time of the first ever Belgrade Pride, which is about 2001. And I remember watching clips of it on my family's computer. And during that first Pride, it was about 30 to 50 people met in the main square in Belgrade to do a very, very tame, small Pride march, just wearing some badges and with some flags and placards. And they were attacked by literally thousands of football hooligans. And it was an absolutely horrific sight. And I think what was very shocking for me as a young person was seeing the presence of Orthodox priests in particular amongst the crowds, joining in with chants like Pedrema, kill the faggots, and, you know, saying that you can't be queer and you can't be Serbian, and that the queer people are going to go to hell. And they should be killed. It was like extremely violent language. And when I first experienced that, it just created such a deep trauma inside of me. If I'm very honest, like it gave me like suicidal thoughts at the time. And I was 11, because I was at an age where I was first starting to realize that I was gay, and I knew there was nothing I could do about it. And I guess it almost felt like my life was over in that moment. And I think for me, you know, well, most people would turn away from their religion or their culture at that moment. I guess, I'm a masochist or something. I just actually became more curious. I was like, well, if I'm going to go to hell, like, what's the ins and outs of that? Or like, is there some way I can get around this? Or like, what can I do? And I started like reading more and more theology. And it was through that I came across the work of queer affirming theologians, church historians, queer Christians. And I realized that, and I'm not saying this just because I'm gay, but like the debate around sexuality in the church is it's a very complex issue. And it's definitely not black and white in the way it was, and frankly, is still portrayed today. And when I kind of realized that made me so angry. And it kind of gave me a passion to really educate and sort of kind of get the word out there that, this kind of really hard line, violently anti-LGBT line is not inherently Christian. And I think actually when you really look at scripture and you really look at Christian tradition, I think that violence is much, much more incompatible with Christian teachings than being LGBT. So, and then also as well, I'm sure we'll get into it more, like my work looks actually at the history of LGBT people in Serbia, especially same-sex relationships. And I think it really undermines completely this frankly ridiculous narrative that the Serbian Orthodox Church has around LGBT people.
And as you mentioned, this pride challenged your personal belief, particularly your sexual identity and your religious identity. There was this rift, which of course I can imagine as an 11-year-old, it can be catastrophical because one does not have the intellectual, perhaps, baggage to confront it. But I just wanted to go back to the Serbian Orthodox Church, or the Srpska pravoslavna crkva, I hope.
Svaka čast, perfect.
And you're saying the Serbian Orthodox Church has remained at the heart of opposition to queer and trans rights. You write that. And not only that, they attend anti-LGBTI marches in Serbia. The importance of this is that in Serbian identity, the Orthodox Church is central and has a great influence.
If you're listening to this podcast and you're not super familiar with like the history of the Balkan region and the different ethnic groups there are sort of the three biggest ethnic groups in the former Yugoslavia are Slavic ethnic groups are Serbs, Bosnians, and Croats. And they have a lot of cultural and in particular linguistic overlap. The languages are virtually identical. But what separates them is religion, and not only religion, but it's also historical context. So, Croatia was more influenced by Central European and Italian political powers through history. Serbia and Bosnia were both under control of the Ottomans, and they were influenced by the Byzantine Empire. But essentially, the sort of core of the three identities come down to these three different religious groups. I think, it's not so much the case today, and yet somehow it also still is that one can't really be Serbian unless they're Orthodox, or there is just such an inherent tie in between the religious identity and the ethnic identity. So when the church opposes something so vehemently, like LGBT rights, they are kind of almost the, how do I put this, like the kind of arbiters of like the cultural identity. It just makes it really difficult to kind of say anything in contrast to it. And in particular, I think what complicates the picture is that, the church has a very close relationship with our sort of very right-wing ethno-nationalist government. And sort of between the two, they kind of police very strictly what it means to be Serbian. And I would disagree, and I think many people would disagree, like very heavily with the way that they sort of portray Serbian identity.
In the latest Balkanism, or the first issue of Balkanism, Diversity and Strength, you write, the heteronormative image of Serbia we are familiar with today began in the later part of the 19th century as a response to Ottoman colonialism and Western cultural hegemony. This change, or this geopolitical shift, gave way to a more contemporary Serbian identity that is aligned with the Orthodox Church, that finding your own nationalism in a way.
Basically, as I sort of mentioned, Serbia was part of the Ottoman Empire for about 500 years. And, during that time, Serbs were like a political minority, and in that, like, there was a sort of privileging of Muslim identity during that period of history. During that time, also the Balkans was very much seen as, well, and you could say still seen now as like kind of adjacent to the Middle East in some way. It was kind of called Turkey in Europe. I absolutely love referencing this like newspaper series that was in a London newspaper called the Westminster Gazette that described the Balkans as savage Europe. And so when Serbia gained its independence from the Ottoman Empire, they wanted to sort of rebrand themselves and repackage themselves and become, a Western European style Christian nation, And in that process, they imported a lot of cultural ideas, cultural norms from the West that actually were contrary or very different to what Serbian culture at the time actually was. One of the ways I demonstrate in a published piece of work I had in the past was the way you see wedding dresses evolve in Serbian culture from the late 19th century to early 20th century. Traditionally, like Serbian wedding costume would have like elaborately embroidered coats or would have an apron covered in gold coins. One of my favorite pieces of traditional costume for weddings is like a crown of peacock feathers, because the peacock feathers are supposed to ward away evil spirits. By the early 20th century, Serbs are wearing white wedding dresses and have adopted many Western wedding customs. Mm-hmm. So there's this fundamental cultural shift at every level to become more culturally Western. And what's kind of bizarre now is that much of the homophobic rhetoric that is espoused by the Serbian Orthodox Church came directly from this period, and they do not really exist in Serbian culture before the 19th century, before the importing of these Western ideas. And what's funny about it is the Serbian Church is saying, we're not going to be like the West, we're going to oppose LGBT rights, but the way they're doing it is actually like a bizarre parody of like 19th century British Victorian values. And it means that there's no ability to see actually the beautiful diversity in Serbian history, especially on the issues of sexuality and gender.
I think that's such an interesting point, because I think it's very reflected within Muslim communities as well, that parallel of taking a Western imported approach to homosexuality or LGBT plus peoples and implementing it within government, and then perpetuating the notion that they are anti-Western today, opposing LGBT plus rights within society, when in actuality they're perpetuating the same kind of homophobia the West imported. So it's such a weird dynamic, and I see it play out within a lot of Muslim communities, especially from a Kosovan perspective, having individuals promote the notion that there is like this inherent opposition or polarization between LGBT and Muslim identities, and not existing as one is something that is really toxic and can be profoundly violent as well. And I guess just going back to, you mentioned kind of like nationalism and kind of like occurring as a Serbian state developed in the 19th and 20th century. There was obviously all kind of national movements tend to be deeply arbitrary in nature and kind of like take a piece from here, take a piece from there, put it in a tava and serve it up to you and say this is Serbian or Albanian or Bosnian or Greek identity, kind of like a hodgepodge of different historical periods. So I guess my question for you is, how do you kind of like relate to a Serbian identity that existed prior to the existence of Serbian kind of like nationalism as it does? And is this something that you kind of like actively try to deconstruct within your work? And I think it's really important because I try to do it in the best way that I can, but do you feel like offering space for individuals to identify with a Serbian culture that isn't so deeply nationalized is important for you?
Absolutely. The analogy I often think of when I think of these, how do we like approach or deal with these national identities is we have like a very traditional kind of carpet in Serbia called a pirotski chilim. And they're usually, I need to get this right, white, black, red, maybe green as well. And with those colors, you can weave so many different patterns and so many different things. But, you know, it's still a pirotski chilim, depending on what patterns it is. And that's sort of how I see the interpretation of history and the interpretation of culture. You can weave those threads one way, or you can weave them another way. And, you know, I was having a conversation with you, Rena, before, I think, where I was saying how, you know, my family is originally from Vranje in the south of Serbia. And their culture there is much more influenced by Turkish culture. It's influenced by Albanian culture as well, and the proximity to it. And growing up, for me, that was seen as like very normal or something that was like celebrated, or, you know, the proximity to Islamic culture was not something that was like to be reviled, or it was just seen as part of my identity, though people see it in Serbs as inherently anti-Muslim, or like there's absolutely no possible kind of reconciliation between the two identities. But that certainly wasn't my personal experience growing up. And I also just feel very conscious. One thing I kind of wanted to say is that growing up in the UK, whenever there's like a Serbian character on a TV show or in a film, he's usually called Dragan. And he's usually like a mafia boss or like a drug dealer or like a warlord of some description. And, you know, Serbia is portrayed as like one of those quote unquote evil ethnicities. Like we're just like a monolithic bad guy. That really informs how British people genuinely think about Serbian people, and probably many other countries. And it's so bizarre to me when people kind of come to me with these really they have these really fixed ideas of what Serbian culture is in their mind, and it's so far from my personal lived experience of what Serbian people are.
So there is this Orientalism, which interestingly is also depicted towards Albania. You know, Liam Neeson, he got all North Albania.
Yeah.
Like, but I understand also how Serbian identity might be connoted to the wars in the 1990s and the Western imagination, the contemporary Western imagination as well. But something that I find quite curious relates to Arbër's points and to what you just said right now, where you write in the Balkanist issue, in an attempt to make Serbia appear more civilized, any queerness was blamed as a result of the influence of the Turkish culture. So there is a sense that, to borrow this term, nascent Orientalism, there is a certain perception towards the Serbian community in the West, but then there is also another layer of Orientalism present in Serbian identity towards what they perceived as the Orient, if I can use this term, this problematic term right now. So in this fusion of the different layers of identity, you search beyond the forced tradition. That is, I think I want to move the conversation now to the significance of Slava, Srčna Slava. And somewhere you write that you've been raised with this idea, gde je Slava, tu je Srbin. Wherever there is a Slava, there is a Serb. What does that mean?
Yeah, so Slava is a Serbian religious cultural holiday. There's some theories as to its origin, but I think most people think that it probably has some origin in pre-Christian Slavic traditions where every family would have its own sort of deity that they kind of focus their worship towards. And when Serbs were Christianized, they replaced that with a patron saint. And every family has their own patron saint. My family's patron saint is Saint Nicholas, which is the most common Slava in Serbia. Vucic's Slava is also Nikoljudan. And it's a 3-day feast, and it's absolutely fabulous. It's like something between a fusion between Christmas dinner and like a birthday for your whole family. And there's some kind of rituals that happen on the day to do with kind of the unity of the family and commemorating the saint and trying to solicit the kind of favor and the blessing of that saint upon the family. And then there's a lot of eating and a lot of drinking, and it's just a good old time. And it's seen as like, I'm going to say, it's probably seen as the most Serbian thing you could do is celebrating Slava. It's just like an absolutely fundamental part of our kind of cultural identity.
Very interesting. As you said, it's a tradition that is often based around kind of like being Serbian and that Serbian sense of self and identity. So I guess I kind of just wanted to explore the impact of saints within kind of like the Orthodox Church, and what you do within your work, which is so fantastic, is you provide queer representation for these saints within a Serbian Orthodox perspective, which is probably so difficult to do. I guess a lot of the listeners would probably want to hear of some examples of saints that engaged in, for example, the practice of pobratinstvo, I hope I said that right, which is like a kind of like relationship of like brotherhood rituals. And I remember reading about it myself and finding it so interesting how like the wedding rituals would often be very similar to a Serbian wedding. So wearing crowns and then often engaging in a kiss and stuff like that. So I guess, yeah, would love to hear about some more kind of like queer saints and their position within kind of like Serbian identity as well.
Yeah, so as I sort of mentioned before, the import of kind of Western notions of homophobia and stuff, you can kind of see that there was a much more diverse view of sexuality and gender in the Orthodox Church in saints, who obviously are holy figures in Orthodox Christianity. One thing I find very interesting that I'd love to write a piece about at some point, a lot of saints you could see as transgender, where women saints live the rest of their lives as monks for various reasons. Saint Matrona is one of them. But in my article I wrote for Balkanism, I wrote about St. Sergius and St. Bacchus, Sveti Srđani Vaho in Serbian, who are described in their hagiography, which is kind of like a biography for saints, as lovers. And there was this ritual called pobratimstvo, which is sometimes also known as like kind of brotherhood unions, which invoked their love for one another. And as Arbër mentioned, it had a lot of kind of similarities to a wedding, an Orthodox wedding, shared communion, binding of hands, and a variety of other things. And I think it would be somewhat anachronistic to describe that exactly as gay marriage. I think gay marriage is a very kind of Western concept, or it's not a Western concept per se, but like I think when we think of a gay marriage, we think of something quite specific, and it probably wasn't that, but it was definitely a space in which queerness could exist in Serbian culture in a way that was culturally relevant and culturally approved. And it was different to marriage, though it's probably also important to note for most of Serbian history, marriage was like arranged marriages, and marriages were not done for love. They were done for, like as they were in most cultures, for dynastic or economic reasons. Whereas in a funny way, one could actually say pobratimstvo was more like marriage than marriage at the time, because this was something that was freely chosen because of a relationship between two people. How it relates to Slava is that there are 78 officially recognized Slavas of the Serbian Orthodox Church. As I said, some are more popular than others, and there is one of those 78 is Srđevdan, which is the celebration of St. Sergius and St. Bacchus. And in my article, I write about how I think that we should be celebrating this Slava as a queer Slava and as a Slava for the queer community in Serbia. This October, in my family's old place in Belgrade, I did that, and I brought together a lot of my trans and queer friends and some of my family, and we had a queer Slava, and it was absolutely fabulous. Though, I'm going to be honest, it was very stressful, because as a diaspora Serb, I had to cook traditional Serbian food for Serbs, and that was stressful, but they said I did very well.
So you passed the test.
I think so. I think I kind of fudged it on some things, but I think I did really well on other things. Yeah.
But I think what you're doing really well is also celebrating queer history within the Orthodox tradition. And I think that is commendable because, as you also say, it's a critical element in the fight for LGBT plus rights and equality. And also beyond that, it shows a different nuance of the Serbian identity, not only in Serbia, but also outwardly, which brings us almost to the end of this conversation.
Could I just say one thing on that, actually,
Oh,
just
yes,
before
of
we
course.
move on? I think where I'm sort of glad that I didn't turn away from my cultural identity and my religious identity when I was young is the fact that I actually think all these traditions and things that were passed down to me are a precious inheritance. You know, these traditions and things that my mum taught me about and I was raised with are so precious and so beautiful. And I think there is so many really important things within that. To me, they're too precious to just be left to the hands of, you know, bad faith actors with far right political identity politics to corrupt and distort traditional Serbian culture. And so what I'm trying to do is celebrate, you know, queerness within Serbian culture in a way that is like authentic and in a way that I think portrays something a bit more real and less kind of, corrupted by the far right.
And that's, I think, fundamental. And I think it's very impressive and inspiring, if I can use this word without it sounding a bit superficial, but it's inspiring because it's not a one-time event, this fight. It's an everyday fight. It's a decision to fight. It's not just, I'm doing it once. And as Arbër and you mentioned earlier, you attend almost every Pride in Serbia since 2016 or so.
I love it. It's great. Belgrade Pride is so much fun. Belgrade has an incredible queer scene. The gay bars are absolutely incredible. The drag is great. You need to check it out. And yeah, I love going to Belgrade Pride every year. And you should come along if you're ever in the Balkans in September, you know, like pop over to Belgrade and we'll have a fabulous time.
And I'd love to. And you know what I also would love to celebrate Božić in Serbia where you cook.
Yeah.
And taste,
Well,
you know, what is your special dish during the Božić celebrations? I think we're just moving to the next point.
yeah. What do I cook on Serbian Christmas? I mean, it's not so prescribed a set of dishes as like a Christmas dinner, like it has to be turkey or this, but like I think you know, a winter favorite of any Serb has to be sarma. And my family, we always eat sarma od vinoglista, so sarma with wine leaves with a bit of yogurt. That's great. I love that. Prebranac, also great. A bit of gibanica. These are delicious foods one could find at a Serbian Christmas table.
And how was the Serbian Božić experience in Somerset?
Oh, well, the reason why Orthodox Christmas is in January is because, so the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church used to be part of the same church, and they had the Great Schism in 1054, using my theology degree here. And afterwards, the Pope Gregory, I can't remember which number, changed the calendar and created the Gregorian calendar, which is the standard calendar we use today, which is 2 weeks behind the Julian calendar, which the Orthodox Church kept. Which means that when we celebrate Christmas on the 7th of January, we're actually just celebrating it on the 25th of December on the Julian calendar. It's also why the Russian October Revolution actually happened in November, because they were still using the Julian calendar in Russia. But yeah, I took a lot of joy as a kid being like, I have 2 Christmases, and everyone was so jealous of me. But also I have a very vivid memory as a kid of going to get my hair cut, and I was like, oh well, it's our second Christmas soon, and the hairdresser looking at my mum kind of confused, and my mum saying something like, oh well, I had to get him to the hairdresser somehow. And I could tell that she was like, in that moment, kind of, she didn't want to talk about being Serbian, or she didn't want to talk about our ethnic identity. And yeah, but growing up, we used to invite all my friends over to eat Serbian food and have a good old time. And it was a lot of fun celebrating Serbian Christmas in rural Somerset. And it felt like another act of that kind of like cultural defiance. And people would be like, oh, are you going to go to Nik's family's like Serbian Christmas party or whatever? And it felt at that point that we were on the aggressive with sharing our cultural identity, like we weren't anymore like the cowering ethnic group. Now we were like spreading our evil to the populace and corrupting them, which was, a lot of fun.
Corrupting with Sarma. I can take that any day.
Yeah. I'm glad to wreck you, of course.
This brings us to the very end of this conversation, and there is one question that I ask everyone. If you could bring one thing from Serbia that is missing for you here in the UK, what would that be?
I think if I was to give like a flippant comedic answer, I'd say something like good roštili or cevapi or something like that, like because Serbian food is so great. But if I was to give an honest answer, honestly, I wish I could show people what my family and my community in Belgrade looks like. Very difficult for Serbian people to get visas to come to the UK. So virtually none of my family have ever visited me in the UK. And I know people have a very strong perception of what Serbian people are like or what Serbian people believe, or I think a lot of people's beliefs would be dispelled if they met my family, my friends, the people I hang out with every day when I'm in Belgrade, because you will never meet a more loving, incredible community, very dedicated to social justice issues, very tolerant, hysterically funny, and a great time on a night out.
That's beautiful. I just wanted to thank you for accepting my invitation. Also, thank you, Arbër, for agreeing to co-host this session today. Nik has been grilled by two Albanians.
And I survived.
He survived. He's used to my grillings, to be fair. So
yeah,
but it's
fair.
great. Yeah. No, but thank you for having me, Rina. And also just to plug Nik's kind of like performances, he is also a drag queen and does amazing things for us as like the Balkan on the Collective, which is our events organization. And yeah, he does fantastic things, kind of like very interdisciplinary. And I think it's so important to provide like a sense of Serbian representation that extends beyond kind of like you said, the stereotype of Serbian people being a certain type of way, but also creating the space, even within this podcast of, two Albanians from Kosovo, you as a Serb from Serbia, engaging in conversation and it being productive and focused on social justice rather than just the same old kind of narrative that tends to dominate a lot of media conversations.
We will risk it. We will be in an article. Look how those Serbs and Albanians are getting along.
Well, our parents were like theoretically born in the same country, and before that, on my family's like birth certificates, my family used to live in Vranja. They were born in the vilayet of Kosovo, because they were like governed from the same region. So smash the borders, we're all one people.
Such a beautiful way to end this conversation. Thank you so much.